Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrissey. I'm Adam Morrissey. Today I'm excited to be joined by Jessica Fialkovich. Jessica is the founder and president of Exit Factor, a consulting firm that helps small to mid-sized business owners prepare to sell their businesses for maximum value. Jessica, thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this conversation because I think what you're doing is very timely and very relevant. We're entering an era that I've heard called the silver tsunami. I think there's a number of other fun terms for it, but basically over the next 15 years, 12 million or so, depending on whose estimates you're going off of, 12 million baby boomer owned businesses are either going to sell, close, or transfer. Where do you think we are, and how do you think about like all the stuff going on within this small to mid-sized business space?
Yeah, so it's funny. So we coined it the seller tsunami, but my podcast co-host and Andy Cagnetta, predicted this back in like 2014. So I believe we're well in the midst of it. Actually, if you look at the data and kind of how we track M&A and who's selling and is by the reason that they're selling, right? So retirement is indicative of baby boomers, and in our M&A offices, retirement has been the number one reason, but it was like 60% of our sellers are for retirement in 2019, and it's continued to go down a little bit every year. So like we're kind of like, I think we're at the peak and even declining a little bit. So because we're at 42% of the business owners are selling for retirement reasons right now. Still a huge amount of businesses that need to transfer or transact in this time frame, but I think, and we can get into this a little bit, but there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 3 years with the pandemic and working environments and culturally that really changed the outcome of the seller tsunami. So at first, when we started talking about this back in 2014 or 2015, there wasn't enough buyers or entrepreneurs to absorb those businesses. Now we've kind of tipped the scales in the other direction, and we've got an even playing field again, which, long story short, is really good for the economy, both at the micro level and the macro level. So, but that's kind of where I think we're in the midst of it right now. There's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of businesses to be transferred, but a lot of them have already transacted at this point too.
Yeah, I mean, I see on the internet like funny memes of you know, stormtroopers marching and it says MBA students getting ready to buy a plumbing company. Why do you think this has gotten so popular?
I mean, like, look, there's the internet influencers, like Cody Sanchez, right? Um, but it has been a course at a lot of the MBA schools and business schools for probably over a decade now. And so I think this entrepreneurship through acquisition has become popular, right? And it's become one of the ways that you can get into owning a business. And I think sometimes, honestly, it's a safer way to get into a business or become an entrepreneur than starting your own thing from scratch. So, another thing Andy and I used to talk about all the time, like, how do we get the word out that buying a business is a good, viable career choice? And this is, again, back in 13, 14, 15. And now the word is out, right? And I think there's a lot of benefits of acquisition over startup. The risk is typically a lot lower. It's easier to get capital and financing for an existing business acquisition than it is to do a startup, right? So there's all of these benefits that I think have just built a snowball effect of why more and more people are attracted to that. And you have a large pool of MBA students and other business owners too are now growing through acquisition. Like, I think it's just really, the word's gone out, but we also have changed a lot of the dynamics in our economy that have preferential treatment to growing through acquisition or acquire a company versus startup. Like, financing is the biggest thing, right? So it is so much easier to get financing for an existing company than it is for a startup. And that includes buying a business. And then we went through the COVID crisis and the pandemic. There were even incentives with lending and financing to buy a business. So there was this just snowball effect. And I think financing really led that. But there's other benefits of why people are more attracted to acquisition than they were, say, 10 years ago.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned the prediction you made years ago. How did you get into it, and how are you in position to grow your companies in the M&A market?
Yeah, so my background, I started my first company when I was 24 years old. My husband and I started a luxury wine company. So we started in retail and then kind of got pulled into this collector's market where we were selling really high end wine to different wine collectors. So think bottles between $500 and $25,000 a bottle, like that kind of high end. So we got into it, and in the middle of the Great Recession, we built a really successful company. But 3 years in, decided it just really wasn't the market we wanted to play in, both the industry and where we were located in the country. And so we sold the company. And going through that process, we were introduced to this entire small business Main Street M&A process that we didn't even know existed, to be honest. So that really intrigued me. Of There's tons of small businesses that transact every single year. And how could we get more involved in that and help business owners like us get out of their business when they're done? So, my husband and I bought our first business brokerage practice in 2013. We started with one small office, just me, him, and our dog, really, in Denver, Colorado, and have built that practice over the last 11 years. So now we're in 3 states, multiple offices in every state, 65 brokers underneath of us, and do about 200 transactions annually. So obviously there's like the conversation we're talking about, there's a lot of opportunity for us to grow. I think the part I'm most excited about is out of that M&A company, our business brokerage office, which is called Transworld Business Advisors, we spun out a new consulting practice called Exit Factor. And we started the company back in 2018. And what Exit Factor does is it helps business owners prepare and position their businesses so they're more profitable, they're more efficient, and ultimately more valuable when they decide to exit, whether that's through a sale or a generational transfer and things like that. And I think that's really where I see not just our biggest growth, but our biggest impact, right? Because the truth of it is, we were talking about baby boomers, but all businesses, if you look at the stats, less than 20% of all businesses in America will exit. The remainder, like that 87%, 8 out of 10 of them, will end up closing their doors. And the reason is not because they're bad business owners or they didn't see the writing on the wall. It's more about they just haven't positioned the business correctly for acquisition. So when we look at where's the biggest upside for our companies, but also mainly where's the impact we can make, is working on that before the transaction preparation of the company.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. When you're sharing that, I was thinking, just putting myself in like the shoes of the 80% and
Mhm.
thinking there might be a number of them out there thinking, well, that would never happen to me.
Oh, all of them think that. Yes.
What has
Yeah.
it been like? What's like the reception been like for Exit Factor?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we never think it's going to be us that doesn't transact, right? I think most of the clients that come into Exit Factor, their primary goal is to increase their value, right? So it's not just about, I don't want to be part of the 87%. It's more about, I am worth X today. I want to be worth Y in 2 years. So, what we do is when we bring in a new client into Exit Factor, we do what's called an exit assessment, which is kind of like a business valuation, but a deeper dive. So it's almost if you take a business valuation and you combine it with a reverse due diligence process and tie some goals into it, and that all has a baby, and that gives them the roadmap and the path to achieving what their exit is. So the reception to that's been really positive because it's now black and white in terms of what they need to do to achieve their goals and then prevent that going out of business scenario. I don't think we ever tell people like, well, you're probably not going to sell your company or you have no exit potential, but we do show them what their exit potential in terms of a value would be today. And really that 87% that go out of business, it's because most of the time it's because they're unwilling to sell for the market valuation versus what their goal is. I mean, I've worked with so many owners across the years and they'd say, well, I think my business is valued $3 million and the market's telling them it's worth 800,000 and they've rather close the doors than take $800,000. Doesn't make any logical sense, but owning a business isn't always just logical, right? There's emotion that's tied to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see, I've been in a couple of these conversations, like large and small, over my career. Do you see, especially as this gets more popular, you mentioned like social media influencers and stuff. Do you see generational differences, and like how are those overcome in these environments?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference, and we were talking in the green room a little bit, is that so baby boomers own or will own an average of 1.2 businesses in their lifetime. Millennials will own 8 businesses across their lifetime. What that on average, right. What that means from a really a big cultural difference is to the baby boomer, that business is personal. It's part of their life, it's part of their identity. It's a very emotional process for them. And they take everything related to that business personally because they've built it over 20, 30 years. They've given up kids' soccer games, weddings, family vacations to build this business, right? It's personal, it's part of that. For the millennial, we're stereotyping here, that's going to own on average 8 businesses, it's a financial asset. It's a transaction. It's logical, right? So you bring two people into a deal or a conversation, and one is emotionally driven and one is logic driven, and you're going to butt heads, right? Because it doesn't matter how much data you show someone in the scenario I just talked about, their business, they want $3 million for it. The markets is saying 800,000. They want $3 million because of the emotional part, because of the blood, sweat, and tears they've invested in it, right? It doesn't matter. A logic argument's not going to win that battle. And so I think that's really the biggest cultural difference you see between the two generations. And Gen X is in there, and they're like kind of in the middle somewhere of 6 businesses, right? Some will own less, some will own more, but the two biggest groups is the baby boomers and the millennials, and also where you see the biggest dynamic changes. So, and that plays out in lots of other little components in business too, right? Um, and I can sit in all of these are generalizations, but baby boomers in general want to see their employees taken care of, right? And legacy plans put into place, and millennials are looking at P&Ls and payroll costs and saying, well, this person looks like they're duplicative in a role, why are going to keep them, right? So it plays out in little tactical dynamics and the transitions between these two, but it comes down to the fact that for a baby boomer, business is personal and emotional, and for the millennial investor, it's logical and financial. And those conversations don't happen well together if neither of those parties can make a bridge to the other side.
Yeah. Could you help, like, where did these, like, the eight businesses for millennials come from? I mean, 1.2 makes sense. Are these numbers for like anybody in the generation, or like anyone in the generation that owns a business?
It's for entrepreneurs on average in the
Got it.
generation.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
and
helpful.
it comes from the exit planning, industries, associations, their numbers and stuff too. But if you think about it, from just how our generations have progressed, right? You go back to the greatest generation, the World War II generation, they got one job when they came back from the war, and they stuck with that job throughout their entire lifetime. Baby boomers were raised to be very similar, right? So even if you don't look at entrepreneurs and you just look at career paths of baby boomers, they've stuck with 1, 2, maybe 3 companies on average. They've been very loyal, right? And then if you think about the challenges everyone had with the millennial generation when they entered the workforce, it's like you look at somebody's resume and they're like, "Oh, well, you stay with that company for 18 months, 1 year, 9 months." Like you just jump around all over the place. But it's really it's been, I think it's indicative too of just a holistic cultural shift where we used to be a culture that created one career path and stayed loyal to that for our entire lifetime. And now slowly we've become more of a shifting generation, we'll call it, or a shifting society where you have different journeys and different paths throughout your lifetime. You don't just stick to one path your entire lifetime.
That makes a lot of sense, especially like you have all these larger investment firms that have the 5-year horizons, and that kind of can trickle down to other people's business plans. And then also with technologies coming in and out, like the life cycle of these businesses is likely going to be shorter. Are people like what are the nature of the 12 million businesses that are going to sell? I'm trying to understand, like, are people buying, are like these new buyers, these new wave of buyers buying things that they already know a little bit about, or are they
Mm.
buying in like completely new industries?
Yeah, so it depends on the buyer type. So there's a few different buyer types. So the first buyer type and the one that we hear most about in small business transactions is private equity or investment firms. And typically, private equity and investment firms they have a group of investors. They're doing what's called a roll up strategy. So they're going to have one main company in an industry. Let's call it HVAC, right? And they call that their platform company. They're going to go out and they're going to find other little HVAC companies to roll up or roll into that main platform HVAC company, hold on to it for a horizon of 3 to 7 years, exit it at a higher multiple than they purchased it for. And that's the return to the investors. So that's one group. And they're very specific in the types of businesses they're searching for at any given time. Specific in industry, specific in resources that they're looking for, sizes, all of that stuff. So that's the one. The second group of buyers is what we call strategic or synergistic buyers. And those are owners of existing businesses that are looking to grow through acquisition. So they're either looking to buy up their competitors, which in that case they're looking for a very specific add-on, again, just like private equity, or a synergistic acquisition is I'm going to look for something that's a similar industry to mine, but not a direct competitor. So think more like vertical integration, like maybe you're buying your supply chain or your customer chain. You could also buy a company where you're referring a lot of business out to do some add-on services. So there's a little bit more flexibility in that type of buyer. But the largest group of buyers, so those two groups of buyers combined probably equate to about 25% of the total business buyers in the market. So the third group is that 70, 80% of buyers are what we call individual buyers. So these buyers are people that are trying to become an entrepreneur through acquisition. And they're not looking for a specific type of company, meaning they'll say, and we get these emails all the time. I'm industry agnostic, meaning I'm willing to look at different industries. But usually, what they're looking at is income replacement. So they'll say, I need a company that makes at least $250,000 a year in owner's earnings, which we call seller's discretionary earnings, right? They'll also be usually specific to the geographic area because they'll be situated with their families in their, call, greater Houston or Oklahoma City. Like they want to stay in their area, right? And then the best of those buyer groups have already identified what they're going to bring to a deal. So some of them haven't identified that yet. And they're just looking for, again, industry agnostic. It's got to make a bunch of money. And I don't want to work day to day in the business is a usually typical one, right? I want to manage the business, not work in it. Which spoiler alert that you work in every business. Doesn't matter if it says owner absentee or not, you've got to put in some work. But the best ones will also know what they're going to bring to the business to amplify it, to take it to the next level. So maybe they're a marketing expert or a sales expert, right? And so the best of them will look for businesses where there's an opportunity there. Maybe they don't have a sales force. Maybe their marketing is, their digital marketing is in the early 2000s and needs to be brought up to date, right? So they'll look for where can they add value and increase the value of the company through their specific skill set.
That was super helpful.
Mhm.
For a lot of these like companies, like how do people get? I think from my experience, there's kind of two things that you're worried about. There might be more, but like customer retention is the biggest one. I'm going to buy this company from somebody that's owned it for several decades. Like, how am I sure that I'm going to be able to keep the customers? And then the second one, if you're doing something you've never done before, is technological obsolescence.
Mhm.
Like, how do I know this thing is going to stay relevant? How are most people getting comfortable with those two things?
So I think honestly, it comes down to whether you're going to be comfortable being as an entrepreneur, being an entrepreneur or not. Because it's what you described as risk, and what you do as owning a business is a risky venture, right? There is no guarantees that the customers are going to stay around, and you can put every plan in place that you can fathom with the person you're buying the business from. It could be a recurring revenue business; everybody asks for that, right? And the customers could all go away. But you know what? You could take over the company and be running a great company for 5 years and something happens and the customers go away. That's just the nature of business. It's risk. And I think what you can do as an entrepreneur is really, again, put in a solid transition plan with that seller to make sure those relationships are transitioned over properly and done well. But then also make sure that you're continuing to refine your skills as a business owner and entrepreneur to retain those relationships over time. Tech obsolescence, I mean, like, look, any industry could be Uberized or AI or whatever. I just got an email earlier that everybody's a tech company, everybody's an AI company. And yes, it is to a certain extent. But I think really what you have to do is be able to read the room and read your industry and see what are the aspects of your industry that are going to be taken over by technology and lead the way through that process instead of being caught off guard. But there is no way to protect that. And I think for the people that get really, really concerned about those types of things and can't get around it and can't fathom a path, owning a business probably isn't the right path, right? At least owning like your own business. Like if you want to invest through a private equity firm or stocks or whatever, great. But those are the burdens that entrepreneurs wake up with every single day. And you either take that risk and you move through it and it drives you, or it paralyzes you. And you have to make the decision whether you're willing to accept it or not.
Yeah, the people leading the companies are the most comfortable with ambiguity. That's the trade-off we make. Um, when you look at, you mentioned like things are slowing down a little bit. There've been quite a few transactions of the last several years. Like, do you think like what are the unknowns that you see as to how this all will play out over the next 10 or 20 years?
Um, I mean, financing and leverage is a huge component. So, unbeknownst to all of my seller clients, there's not a million people running around with millions of dollars in cash in their pockets that are willing to just buy businesses. So, really, the lending and the financing industry drives transactions because if you can't get leverage on these companies, or if leverage is too expensive. That's really, and I think we've really seen it in the last 18 months, is the primary driver of the marketplace. Because what will happen is that debt becomes so expensive, it'll drive the valuations down, and then the valuations drive down. So then business owners retreat and pull their businesses off the market. And, it's the whole circle of life where then supply shrinks and everything. Right. So I think that, from what I've seen in the M&A market, is the number one driver of how many transactions are going to get done, what valuations we're going to get them done at. We've heard over the last few months that the Fed is going to start to bring down those prime rates, which will affect all of the other rates for financing and lending as well. If that drives volume back up and it drives multiples back up, we kind of have our answer. So, but that's the biggest unknown. And that's tied to macroeconomic factors that we have somewhat control over as individuals, and US citizens, not a ton, as we know. But, the interest rates are going to be tied to macroeconomic factors. But I think that's things we have to be aware of when we're talking about these big macro shifts and inflation and using interest rates to control and adjust inflation, like the negative effects that it could have all the way down to small business as well, too.
Awesome. Is there one piece of advice you give to people that are either considering or selling a small business?
Considering selling a small
Yeah,
business?
well, one is there
Yeah.
is there a standard advice you give to people considering buying, and then is there a piece of
Oh,
advice you
yeah.
give to people selling?
So we'll start with the buying side. So I tell everybody to just window shop. And I'm sorry to all my broker colleagues that are like, stop telling people to do that. But really, you can't understand the process of buying a business, or you can't understand the dynamics of owning a small business until you start going through the process. So you have to window shop, look at businesses that are for sale, sign non-disclosure agreements, do some due diligence, go through some buyer seller meetings to figure out what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. So that's my big piece of advice for buyers. I also say talk to lenders early, right? Because you want to understand what type of leverage you qualify for as an individual. The business will play a component in that, but you also have to understand what your individual options are. So buyers, go window shop, enjoy, have fun, figure out what you like and don't like. On the sell side, my advice is you probably are starting the sell process too late. So we've all heard that, you have to begin with the end in mind, and it's so important in business. And if you didn't start planning your exit on day one, which most of us didn't, the next best day is today. So when you go to exit your company, and because we just talked about how leverage and debt and financing are such a big component in any exit. And this means if you're going to sell your business, if you're going to give it to your kids, if you're going to give it to your employees or sell it to your employees, you're going to need some type of financing to get you money out of the business so you can leave, right? And at the end of the day, what the financing guys care about is the last 3 to 5 years of history and proven results. So if you're starting today and you want to be out of the business in 12 months, they're going to look back at the last 5 years. And if those 5 years aren't good enough for you or good enough for the bank, then you end up in that 87%, right? So you really need to build a strong foundation of a business and have proven results 3 to 5 years before you even consider exiting. So that's why I always say you might as well start today because you don't know when your exit's going to be. None of us do.
Mhm.
Um, and then you're just running a better business day to day and you have the choice to exit. So
Yeah, I think you see a lot of sad stories of people that aren't prepared and then disappointed about how things end.
yeah, most business owners, and like I don't have like a source for this, but just from our data, like like 9 out of 10 business owners sell for personal reasons, not because there was a plan in place. And we're talking very small businesses to very large businesses. But I said in my book, like people forget entrepreneurs are people, right? And we have the same personal issues as everybody else does. We have illness, we have family issues, we have relocation, we have other opportunities we face, we have death sometimes. Like these are the reasons people exit their business. Burnout's number one, not because I had this 5 year plan and it says today I'm going to exit my business. That's not why people sell. So they sell because their spouse gets
Yeah,
a job across the country or their, father-in-law gets sick and now they have to take care of them. That's why people sell.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's just so much value to intentionality and really
Mhm.
figuring out what you want and what a successful outcome is. Because I feel like in a lot of these arrangements, people don't know what they're looking for, and then they're only left with ideas and comparison.
Yes. Totally.
Yeah,
Yes. I agree. It's just and the ideas in comparison ultimately lead back to that beginning of our conversation is like it's money and then there's an emotional component behind that money and you can't negotiate emotion with logic, right? So
no, that's a separate conversation. One I'd love to have. But Jessica, you've been really gracious with your time. Before I let you go, any reading materials or content sources you recommend for listeners keeping up on this
yeah.
space?
Well, I probably should mention my own book, which is called Getting the Most for Selling Your Business. It's available on Amazon. I mentioned my podcast co host, Andy Cagnetta. He also has a great book called Closing the Deal, which is more about the negotiation part of
Mhm.
getting a deal done. So those are two of my favorite.
Awesome. We'll have links to both of those in the episode show notes. But Jessica, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays with More. See, that conversation was with Jessica Fialkovich. Jessica is the founder of a company called Exit Factor that helps companies prepare to sell their businesses. What I thought was so interesting about that conversation was that less than 20% of companies successfully sell or transfer their business. The other 80 or so percent close. What I also think is fascinating is just how timely and relevant this is with over 10 million businesses preparing to sell over the next 10 years or so. If you enjoyed the show, share it with your friend, leave a review, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.